Okay, thank you very much. Pressure's on for me to live up to that wonderful introduction. First thing I want to do is say thank you so much to Judy and all the members of the center. And I want to tell you all something here. This center is terrific. It's awesome. I don't have anything like it in Irvine. It's just little old me in Irvine. So I'm very happy to be here and to be a part of this center, which is such a terrific part of a terrific movement for at least one day. I have 25 minutes to try and capture for you the importance of the issue of sex influences on brain and body. I'm going to talk a little bit on a general level why it's so important, and then a little bit about my own research. And try not to run over because I know a lot of you have busy schedules. I'm going to start with a question. Are men and women the same or different? The answer is yes. Men and women are same, and it's similar in many respects, and they are different a little to a lot in other respects. The problem is that the biomedical research community has long not believed the different part, hence ignored the different part, and this has been to the detriment, in particular, of the health of women. And this is all starting to change. The answer is same or different. So I'm going to try and capture the importance of all this for you in now 23 minutes with a talk that's going to have three parts. First, I'm going to quickly introduce myself, give you a little background on who I am and how I got drawn into this issue. Then I'm going to talk about this issue on a more general level. Why is it so important? What has been the resistance? Sometimes people hear about it and they go, well, this is obvious we should be studying men and women. Why haven't we been? Or why have we been focusing only on male animals, for example? And then, because I got to tell you something about my research, I'll tell you a little bit about what's happened in my lab, where we study emotional arousal, memory, and the brain. Since in the last 15 years, we stopped assuming that sex doesn't matter and started assuming that it can and probably does, and we better understand how. So the background, for about 35 years, I have studied emotional arousal, memory, and the brain. How it is that all of you probably remember where were you on the morning of September 11th? I'll bet most of you do. Where were you on the morning of September 10th? Nobody. Well, we think we know why, or at least we have a big part of the reason why. And it's a hypothesis that's derived from a lot of animal research, almost exclusively in male animals, that holds that during and after an emotional event, the stress hormones start flowing. You all know that, the fight or flight response. But we've discovered that this stress hormone response has a second, longer-term function. It feeds back to the brain through a little structure that you each have two of, a couple inches from your ears on either side, little almond-shaped structure, and the Latin word for almond is amygdala. So the idea is that the stress hormones feed back to this little amygdala, turn it on, and then the amygdala tells the other parts of your brain, like a rheostat, crank it up, remember it, that's more important. And so what we think we have here, and the research on this goes back 50 years, is an evolutionarily beautiful way for you to remember important things. Now, and as I say, it's heavily based in animal research where we give injections to animals and we lesion their amygdala and stuff like that. Now, about 20 years ago, I returned from a postdoc in Germany to Irvine because I wanted to know this model, was it true in humans or not? And so I started to do things like PET scan studies and giving drugs to humans. And when you start to study the human animal, you start to study, if you've been an animal researcher like I was in my career, you start to study for the first time this thing called the female. Because we don't study females in animal research. I'll get to that in a minute. And to cut to the chase, I discovered this. About the year 2000, while trying to study the brain mechanisms involved in storing emotional memories, PET and fMRI studies, I found a sex difference in this little amygdala, which you see before you. I found that it was the amygdala in the right hemisphere of the brain that was better at predicting how well men would remember the emotional material I was showing people. And it was the amygdala in the left hemisphere of the brain that was better at predicting how well women would remember the same emotional material. Now that was a major fork in the road, and I had to ask the question, what does this mean? I can tell you that as an untenured assistant professor, I was advised by senior people who wanted me to succeed to get the hell away from this issue. And they weren't joking. They weren't joking. This was career suicide, but I felt there was something important going on. So it drew me into the topic of sex differences in the brain more generally. And I did what I like to do. I went to the library, and I started to teach myself what we knew at the time, in the year 2000, about sex differences in the brain. And I started to realize I was filled with a bunch of biases that I had been inculcated with during my education in the 70s and 80s that were wrong. Now, what was I filled with? Oh, I was filled with this idea. Here's a paper from 1966, Scientific American, Sex Differences in the Brain. And basically, if you read the paper, there's sex differences in the brain is about one thing: reproductive behaviors. Sex behaviors, sex hormones, a little tiny structure called the hypothalamus, stop. That's what I believed up until about the time I got that amygdala effect and I started to look. And what I've subsequently found is that couldn't be more wrong. It couldn't be more wrong. There are sex differences everywhere in mammalian brain function. Every lobe of the brain, every transmitter system of the brain. There are sex differences in primate play behavior. Did you know that female monkeys tend to play with the same toys as little human girls, and male monkeys tend to play with the same toys as little human boys? There's sex differences in knockout animals, transgenic animals. There's sex differences in individual brain structures, in the size of the neurons, the structure of the neurons, the composition. There's even sex differences in neurons in petri dishes. So they'll culture neurons from male and female rats, and then they'll study, for example, how the neurons die. And they find sex differences in petri dishes. So it's everywhere. I'm going to try and capture this with one example from animal research. It's a little boring maybe to look at, but it's going to capture, I could give you thousands of these. I'm going to give you one to capture the importance of this issue. This is from some colleagues at Irvine who are interested in what happens when women smoke to the developing baby. So what they do is they expose female rats that are pregnant to nicotine. Then when the baby rats become the equivalent of rat teenagers, they take a look at their brains for the changes from the exposure to nicotine. And what you're looking at here, the blue bars are, what you're looking at is about 15 different genes, all related to the white matter. Okay? So you're looking at the expression of genes related to the white matter. And what you can see is the animals exposed to the nicotine in utero, the blue bars, the expression of these genes related to the white matter is significantly elevated compared to the controls. Okay, so your conclusion would be, wow, exposing a baby to nicotine in utero massively upregulates the activity of genes related to the white matter. What does that mean? That's your next question, but that's quite a finding. And that's what you would believe until you looked at the females. This was all the males. Right. Now right away you should see that if you only studied males, which is mostly what we do, you'd be only half right about what nicotine exposure does to brain white matter function. If you studied males and females, but you clumped them together because you didn't believe this stuff matters, and just clump them together will increase our statistical power, what would you do? You would wash out two effects. You'd end up with two wrong conclusions, right? I can give you literally, you don't want me to do it, but I can give you 1,000 examples, and I can get you to believe that sex differences are everywhere in mammalian brain function. Now, but they've been discovered by people despite the fact that the field overwhelmingly studies just the male. So a guy named Irv Zucker at Berkeley a couple years ago did the math, found that we study about 5.5 males for every female. A group at Northwestern did a similar thing, found that we basically study the male. The blue bar is the males. This is animal research now. We don't study females. Surprisingly, this group from Northwestern found something that might surprise all of you. Even when we're studying diseases that are dominant in women, only 12% of the time do we study female animals. Now you're laughing, because it is kind of stupid, but it's more important to understand why is it like this. And I'll get to that in a minute, but first I want to say, does this really matter? I mean, so male, female rats, do we really care? I'm going to convince you that it matters by showing you some data. Data reported to the FDA on side effects, all kinds of side effects, nausea, tinnitus, you name it. And I'm going to show you side effects, depression, anxiety, tremor, type 2 diabetes, tardive dyskinesia, all kinds of side effects reported to the FDA for the top 10 selling drugs in the United States of America. The light green bars are reports in women. The dark green bars are reports in men. Everybody pay attention. We're going to go through the top 10 selling drugs in America. You should start to see a pattern by now. Okay. Now, before you conclude, well, women just complain more, I urge you to consider that this is exactly the pattern of results that must be produced by a system that overwhelmingly studies the male until all the way at the end, phase 3 clinical trials, when they throw in half females and don't even look at the data. A system like that must produce, if sex differences matter, that pattern of negative effects being far more predominant in women than in men. So what about that phase 3 stuff? Well, you might have heard, we heard in one of the earlier videos, that in 1993, they passed a law that said, well, you got to start studying females, NIH Revitalization Act. Well, what happened there? As the GAO reported just last year, what happened was the scientists who really didn't believe that sex matters all that much, because the law made them, started to put women in at the very tail end, phase 3 clinical trials. But then they didn't look at the data. They kind of went, okay, we're done with that. And what happened was it caused more harm than good, and people are now starting to realize it, including here we are in Colorado, a former Colorado representative who was in the midst of the 1993 law, who, when hearing that for 20 years the scientists hadn't been looking at the data, she said, she had this wonderful line. She said, it's very frustrating. It reminds me of when you ask your children to put the clothes from the washer to the dryer, and then you go back to and the clothes are still wet, and they say, well, you didn't tell me to turn it on. And that's frighteningly accurate to what the scientists were doing. Now, why the resistance? I need to keep moving here. I want to be quick here. You can't move this center stage where it belongs unless you understand what's keeping it from moving center stage. Can't do it. So I've thought a lot about why the resistance? Is it a bunch of sexist white males? No. That's probably part of it, but I think it's a relatively small part of it. The real reasons, I think, have to do with, first of all, this belief, kind of an interesting belief, that the females are too variable. It's a strange thing because real women have real menstrual cycles, but somehow it was viewed as a reason to study only males. Same guy at Berkeley recently did a study about 5 years ago in the animals. Are the female animals really more variable? The answer was no. So that one's been knocked down. But I think the key sorts of resistance is reflected in this quote that a colleague of mine, an fMRI guy at Irvine, said about 5 years ago. We were talking about sex differences. He was trying to say why he doesn't really think it's important. And he said, well, Larry, it's not that I'm not interested in sex differences. It's just that I want to understand the fundamental mechanisms first. And that's it. The key problem here with this whole issue is the belief that what all the men and the women in this room share is what's fundamental. And what they don't share is not fundamental. And I thought, where does this come from? I'm going to skip it over for the sake of time, but if you go back all the way to the dawn of modern science and William Harvey and the circulation of the blood, when William Harvey figured this out, no one said, I wonder if it's true in women. I'm only being partially facetious. I'm going to skip over this, but we have a 500-year tradition of believing. When Watson and Crick gave us the DNA double helix, no one said, I wonder if it's a triple helix in women. We have a 500-year tradition of believing that the fundamental is the shared. That's why it's fundamental. Sex differences is all about, no. There's fundamental shared stuff and fundamental different stuff, and we need to start paying attention to it. Now, ironically, you've probably heard about this big movement for individual differences, personalized medicine, right? The big deal. Comes at you from people like Francis Collins, head of the National Institute of Health. Even President Obama talked about precision medicine. There's an immense irony where a lot of the people who will tell you how important individual differences are, the same people will tell you you don't really need to worry about the most biologically fundamental of individual differences, male or female. So the sex differences issue should be driving the train towards personalized medicine, and yet it's been until now largely kicked off the train. Okay, final issue that has kept this thing, been a source of resistance, kept it stuck in the corner, is politics. I have been called a neurosexist because I'm interested in what Mother Nature thinks about this. You may not have heard of this woman, but you've heard of Gloria Steinem, who was quoted saying, it's really a remnant of anti-American crazy thinking to do this kind of research. Now, academia is filled with a lot of people who think this way, and that's why I was warned to stay out of this as an assistant professor. So that's been one of the sources of problems. But fortunately, that stuff is now crumbling. I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to go to a final point on the general importance of this before I take you to my research. A lot of my colleagues come up to me when I start talking about sex differences in the brain or the liver or the heart, and they say, why should this be? That evolution shouldn't have produced all this. And I too struggled with that because I didn't get it until I went back and read Darwin. Who reads Darwin? I went back and read Darwin, and I discovered that what I was taught about Darwin was wrong. You were all taught, and you probably all believe, that Darwin said that evolution proceeds by natural selection. It's not what he said. He said evolution proceeds by natural selection and a separate force he called sexual selection, without which the whole thing fails. What Darwin was trying to explain was a whole bunch of things, the most famous of which is this. Darwin knew that according to his theory of evolution by natural selection, he shouldn't exist. Think about it. That tale is a great way to end up dead. It is. So why does he exist? The answer, according to Charles Darwin, was not natural selection. It was sexual selection. She likes it. And that's one of the reasons I like this picture so much, because if you take a look at her, she doesn't look all that impressed. Doesn't she? She looks like she's saying, put it away, pal. I've seen better. But the reason they look so different in their bodies and in their brains, the brain is part of the body, was not natural selection, it was sexual selection. Sexual selection is a force that by definition acts male against male, female against female. So sexual selection is a force that by definition must produce sex differences of all sizes, of all shapes, at all levels of body function. The point here, and the reason I'm taking time on this, is if you believe in evolution, the way Darwin described evolution, not the way you learned it in high school, as a complex mix of natural and sexual selection forces, then you must believe, you have no choice but to believe, that it produced bodies and brains of men and women that are a complex mix of similarities and differences, exactly what it seems to have been produced. Let me take you now, and by the way, Darwin got a lot of grief for this concept, as he did for natural selection, and he weathered the grief like only Darwin could, and at the end he said, my conviction in the power of sexual selection remains unshaken. Okay, so we're sitting here, the end product of natural and sexual selection forces, and we should have been looking for sex differences all along. Okay, back to emotion, memory, in the brain. You'll just remember that I discovered this. And I had a question, what does this mean? And for the last 15 years, my lab has been pursuing, what does this mean, that there's this sex difference regarding this little structure, the amygdala, so important for emotional memory? And I'm going to give you a sampling now of some of the things we've discovered. One of the things we do in my lab is we stress people. My lab's about emotion and memory, so we like to stress people, get the stress hormones going, and see how that affects memory. And one of the ways we do it is we drop people's arms in ice water. We've done this to a lot of people now, including, interestingly, Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes. I don't know how good her memory is of this, but we did it. And a student of mine, Joe Andriano, now at Harvard, had people learn some new material, listen to a story, then he dropped their arms in ice water. Then to activate the stress hormones. Then he waited a week, tested their memory. What did he find? Well, he found that the arm in ice water enhanced memory very nicely in the men. And even though it activated the stress hormones, it didn't enhance memory in the women in our studies. Joe went on to take a look at the effect in the women, this time dividing women up into 3 different stages of the menstrual cycle. One with low hormones total, one with high estrogen, one with high progesterone. And he found 3 different relationships between the stress hormones and memory in the 3 different hormonal cycles. And you can imagine that if you didn't pay attention to the hormonal influences, like we didn't in this study, they'd wash each other out. And you would get no effect of and that's exactly what we think happened. So here we have, in this kind of boring looking study, we have the first evidence in all the years of people looking at stress hormones and memory. This boring little set of graphs, published about 6 years ago, was the first evidence that what the stress hormones do to memory, like adrenaline, at least in women, depends upon the status of the sex hormones. Nobody ever looked before, because everybody thought it didn't matter. Another thing we found, there's a certain drug called a beta blocker. You've probably heard of beta blockers. They were used for heart indications. They're sometimes used in anxiety. Well, we had reasons to think that they would suppress the emotional memory system, being related to adrenaline and the stress hormones. And we found out that they did. But for the first time ever, we divided our results up into men and women. And we found that the beta blocker impaired emotional memory differently in women and men. The graph is boring, but what the graph says is the drug, the beta blocker, impaired memory for the gist of a story in men, but impaired memory for the details of a story in women. Same story, same drug, same everything, sex difference in what it's doing to memory. Some of my students went on to explore this gist detail thing in different ways. So a student, Belinda Pletzer, now back at the University of Salzburg, take a look at the little figure in the top left corner there. What does it look like? An S made of Fs. And it turns out that we all tend to focus on the global before the local, the gist before the detail. We tend to see the S before we see the F. But that effect goes strikingly down in women who are at the high hormone mid-luteal phase of their cycle, which Belinda found. So again, a shift towards details in the high hormone phase of the women's cycle. Another study, Sean Nielsen, now at USC, and it's no accident that it's all female graduate students, or mostly, because they care, because they want to know. Another student, Sean Nielsen, regarding this gist detail thing said, okay, so if there's some sort of female advantage for detail memory, especially at the high hormone phase, what happens if you're on the pill, on hormonal contraception? I said, good question, I don't know. So Sean did the study. She had naturally cycling women and women on hormonal contraception watch a short emotional story. A week later, she tested their memory. The naturally cycling women showed enhanced memory for the details of the story, not the gist. The women on the pill showed the opposite. They showed enhanced memory for the gist, not the details. She went on to show that that's also what she sees in men and in women at the low hormone phase of the cycle. Now, does all this affect the brain? Well, another student, Nicole Peterson, now at UCLA, said, okay, let's take women who are on the pill and put them in an fMRI scanner. If the pill is affecting emotional memory, as I just showed you it is, what is it doing to the amygdala, this heart of emotional memory? And this was published now just a year ago. The two tall gray bars are the response of the left and right hemisphere amygdala in naturally cycling women to a bunch of unpleasant pictures. Right? The two smaller bars on the right are the response of the left and right amygdala to the same unpleasant pictures in women on hormonal contraception. So hormonal contraception is producing a sharp blunting of the response of this critical little emotion structure, the amygdala, to these things. Furthermore, the bottom left, the crosses with the star, naturally cycling women show a shift over the menstrual cycle in which amygdala, left or right, is responding more to the emotional stuff. No one ever found that before because no one looked. So there's this natural shift across the menstrual cycle in hemispheric dominance regarding the amygdala. And the bottom right and the pill just eliminates that. Now notice, I am not saying this is a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying it's a thing. Possibly an important thing. It might be a good thing. It might help prevent women from getting post-traumatic stress disorder and whatnot. But it is something that we've utterly missed because we utterly assumed it didn't matter. Now I'm going to wrap up, and I'm doing all right, 1:34. Is this only a women's health issue? No. This is bigger than that. To illustrate that to you, I want to tell you about a group of drugs called lazeroids. The Upjohn Company in the 1980s spent millions of dollars developing lazeroids, named after the biblical figure Lazarus. So effective were they at blocking damage after stroke. The problem was they only worked in men. First study, men who had placebo, who had a hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage, a stroke, 53% of them died. Men who had the lazeroid, nobody died. Their stock prices are going up at Upjohn. Women, no effect. Why? Nobody knows. Upjohn spent 10 years and tens of millions of dollars trying to fix the problem. Came away with nothing. FDA wouldn't approve it. Upjohn went out of business. But wait, why didn't they approve the drug for men? Because nobody was ready for it. People couldn't believe that sex mattered all that much, that it could make a difference in whether or not a stroke drug would affect people's brains. They couldn't buy it. And so it went away, and how many hundreds of thousands of men have died who needn't have died? So is this just a women's health issue? No. This is an everybody health issue. Is it disproportionately a women's health issue? Yes. But it's much more than just a women's health issue. Time for me to wrap up. 11 seconds, 10, 9, 8. So same or different? The answer is same and different. It's incumbent on us now to start to pay more attention to the different part. And sure enough, that's exactly what's happening as of this year. For the first time in history, the NIH is starting to require all investigators, all 27 institutes, to seriously consider sex differences in their grants. Never did it before, but it was the work of all the people like Judy and all the other people who are at this that made that happen. A landmark, I think, issue of Neuroscience Journal is coming out, which I happen to edit. In 1 week, this issue comes out. First ever issue of a neuroscience journal ever devoted to sex differences. And to show you that it's not a one-off, the journal is changing their policies like the NIH so that all future studies have to consider sex differences. It's big stuff, it's zeitgeist changing stuff, and I'm proud to be a part of it. I'll end with Victor Hugo, who said there's one thing stronger than all the armies in the world, and that is an idea whose time has come. This is an idea whose time has come, and I thank you very much. I know a lot of you have to leave, but I'm happy to stick around for questions.
Do you want to take some now?
I'll take some now, sure.
We have a few minutes. You want to take one or two questions?
Stunned silence.
We're running ahead of schedule, so.
My question is, you were involved with the 60 Minutes report on Ambien. What has happened to Ambien?
The question was, I was involved with the 60 Minutes report on Ambien. What has happened with Ambien? What has happened with Ambien? And the answer is nothing. The Ambien remains the only drug today that the FDA has required, not suggested. They're very good at making suggestions and guidances. But this remains the only drug that they have required the manufacturers to have different doses. And remember, dose is just one aspect of a much, much bigger, broader issue. But Ambien remains, to this day, to this minute, the only drug for which it is required that there be different recommended dosages. Now I ask you, on the basis just of what you've heard today, is Ambien likely to be the only one? No.
I have a question
Yes?
about postmenopausal women.
The question was, what about postmenopausal women? Well, we heard earlier about just that. It's absolutely the case that there's going to be all kinds of differences that are happening in women, obviously different from men. We tend to know very little about it. I can say one intriguing thing that will tie into what I just told you. You know, I gave you that amygdala sex difference, right? Women on the left, men on the right. One group has taken that study into postmenopausal women, and the amygdala sex difference goes away. Women don't stop being women when they go through menopause. So that fact tends to suggest that this driving force of my amygdala effect is probably hormonally based. And probably there's something about a naturally cycling woman, in particular at the high hormone second half of the phase, that has a left amygdala that's driving detail function and may predispose her, therefore, to all manner of anxiety disorders related to that left amygdala function. These are all huge questions that nobody really knows the answer to because nobody cared. Yeah?
I vaguely remember a book that was published some years ago on sex differences called The End of Men. Do you have any comment about that?
He says he vaguely remembers a book published a few years ago called The End of Men. I think that's a little premature. Yeah? Can't hear you. So that's a very good question. Should we be concerned about taking medications? Logically, from what I've said, the answer is yes, but not in, I think, a panicky sort of way. There are some self-correcting mechanisms that come into play, like we adjust dosages often for people. People adjust their own dosages often. But here's what I think you should do. With all zeitgeist shifting changes like this, it starts with recognition and consciousness. I think you should ask, every woman in particular should ask every physician, has this been carefully tested in women? Unfortunately, the answer is going to be yes, even though that might not be the answer, but it's a start. To give you an idea of how crazy is the bias towards studying the male and accepting that the results in the male will apply to the female. We saw just last year the first oh gosh, the drug for women, the female equivalent of Viagra. What was the name of it? The female equivalent of Viagra. It had a name. Anyways, when they were testing this drug, they needed to test for interactions between. Geez, I almost just had the name. They had to test. You can see it hasn't been a big success. They had to test for interactions with this drug. Adyi, thank you, Addyi, Adyi, for her, and that's what it is. And they had to test. Follow me on this. They had to test, reasonably enough, interactions of this new drug with alcohol. Good thing to test, right? Well, it turns out that they couldn't test it in women because they all got too sick. So they did it in 23 men. I'm not making that up. That was last year. And the FDA went, yeah, we're good. That's how bad it's been. The good news is, folks, it's changing, and it's changing thanks to consciousness changing and efforts of all kinds of people like Judy in this organization. Yeah? Well, So, yeah. The question is, do I have any advice about? She's right that I approach this as a scientist. My job is to figure out what Mother Nature cares about, and I don't care what anybody else cares about. That's my whole function in society. That's my job, is to try and care about what Mother Nature cares about, and then let the rest happen. Although I do believe the scientist has an obligation to get out there and let people know what they think Mother Nature cares about. But what do you do about the people who then take this information and run all over with it? I don't have an answer other than slam them as best you can. Whenever anyone is running too far, too quickly, too wildly from what the results actually allow, speak up and say so. I don't have a better answer than that. There was a question. Oh, there was a woman over here who had a question.
I'm just curious about the conscious changing, the ideas are changing in research. I'm wondering if it's changing in the drug companies and what the reception is as far as the drug manufacturers.
The question is, things are changing in science. What about the drug companies? I spoke a year ago at the first ever session, to our knowledge, at a major drug company on this topic. And I tried to get the point across that this issue matters both from a scientific perspective, a moral perspective, and a legal perspective. So I was talking their language, and I was basically saying the less you can defend scientifically your results, your drug being put out equally for men and women, the less you can defend it legally. And so my answer from that one thing is that the drug companies are aware of it. I have heard horror stories from people in drug companies of higher-ups hearing about sex differences and saying, put that away, just put it away, we don't want to hear about that. So that attitude is alive and well, but not amongst the smarter executives. The smarter executives are going to figure out that it's not a bad thing to have your drug go to half the population. That's still a lot of people, right? And it's not a bad thing to have drugs that are much better tailored to the patients so that you have far less side effects and problems and complications and deaths. So it's shifting in the industry world, but it's got its own sort of sources of resistance there that I can see being outside the industry world.
Okay, so you'll hang around for some.
And I'm happy to answer more questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Very nice. Please help me thank Dr. Cahill. Okay, before we leave today, I would like to let's put the table captains to work here. So last year I talked about the visceral joy of giving. But I have a confession to make. Some things are more joyful to give to than others. Now, I'm a cancer survivor, and when the American Cancer Society sends me the little envelope and says, "Will you give?" I dutifully write a check and give to them. But it isn't really that joyful. When I write a check to the Center for Women's Health Research, there's joy in that, and I'm trying to figure out why is that. And I think it's because what you do is what I call line of sight science. I can look at Carrie, and I know Carrie. I can take her to lunch. I can understand what her research is. I can have a personal relationship with this center. I can go home tonight, and I can look at my wife and my daughter and go, wow, what they're doing here can affect them in their lifetime. And my check can make a difference. And I can look and see that federal law has changed in a short span of 20 years that the center's been around. I don't get that same feeling at other places. So I ask you today to join me in supporting tangibly the Center for Women's Health Research in their quest to do line of sight science and that will benefit all our families. Thank you very much. Appreciate you being here today.